This podcast contains explicit language. Welcome to the James Chambers Show. I'm your host for this podcast, James Chambers. It's been a few weeks since I've done an episode, and I really missed it. So I'm really glad to be back in the studio. This feels really good. Just some quick housekeeping before we get into today's main topics. Our little 17-week-old Great Dane puppy is doing awesome. She's huge. She's heavy. She's growing like a freaking weed. I'm really excited that she's really grown into our household. So we're really happy to have her. So between her and our jobs and keeping up with the housework, barely, it's just the wife and I are just occupied all the time. Don't worry, I have at least half a dozen show ideas on the burner right now, and I'll be enlisting some help from other people to add some content to those episodes, including many of you, I hope. It'll be a lot of fun and hopefully informative. And that being said, let's get into the first part of today's show. As you probably recall 2 years ago, Senator Mitch McConnell essentially stole a Supreme Court seat from then-President Barack Obama. McConnell refused to even hold hearings on the confirmation of Obama's nominee, Merrick Garland, let alone allow for a vote. This bit of craven politicking absolutely paid off. Instead of a moderate jurist on the Supreme Court, we got a Trump-appointed conservative, Neil Gorsuch. Now, Justice Kennedy is retiring from the bench, leaving another SCOTUS vacancy to be filled by Trump. And now we know who that person is. In the first half of the show, we'll go over who Brett Kavenaugh is, his history, and how he's likely to rule if he's appointed to the Supreme Court. In the second half of the show, we're going to talk about how he got nominated in the first place and who is in the shadows directly influencing Trump's court appointments. Stick around. You're going to want to hear about that part. Let me be perfectly clear. It's completely normal for sitting presidents to nominate Supreme Court justices. Sometimes several jurists get seated just in the first couple of years of office. So I'm not criticizing Trump's right to nominate a judge. My deep-seated frustration about the president's pick is that there was an inappropriate and unprecedented level of stonewalling and outright disrespect to the former president, Mr. Obama, that led to Mr. Trump having 2 Supreme Court picks instead of the one he legitimately has claim to. McConnell effectively stacked the court, ensuring a hard-right conservative bias for at least a generation. That was wrong, immoral, and it proves without a shadow of a doubt that the GOP leadership is morally bankrupt and willing to skirt norms and the rule of law when it suits their agenda. If the Democrats had done what McConnell and his cronies did, I would be just as harsh on them. But they didn't. This lands fully at the feet of Mitch McConnell, Speaker Ryan, and the GOP caucus who enabled this theft and who, without remorse, slapped the American people in the face. On to Mr. Trump's legitimate pick from the Supreme Court, Brett Kavenaugh. Brett Kavenaugh is a product of Washington, D.C.'s culture. He represents the swampiest ideas of the conservative political elite. Brett went to a Jesuit all-boys Georgetown preparatory school and then attended Yale and Yale Law. Interestingly, he was there at the same time as one Neil Gorsuch. His father, Edward, was a lobbyist for the cosmetics and toiletry industry, and his mother, Martha, was a teacher in D.C. who became a lawyer and then a circuit court judge. Brett comes from a family of heavyweights who knows the ins and outs of the legal and political system. He's connected, he's well considered in all of the right circles, and he even lives in an upper-middle-class suburban neighborhood near the Capitol alongside many political elites from both sides of the aisle. Kavenaugh has a long track record in D.C. politics as well. After graduating Yale, he and Gorsuch both clerked for Supreme Court Justice Anthony Kennedy, the same Kennedy he has been nominated to replace. Brett worked for the George H.W. Bush administration under then Solicitor General Ken Starr. After Bush left office, Kavenaugh stayed with then independent counsel Ken Starr while investigating the Clinton White House. It was largely his work that led Congress to enter articles of impeachment against Bill Clinton. After the Clintons left the White House, Brett worked for George W. Bush as a legal counsel and then his staff secretary for 5 years. Since then, Kavenaugh has been a jurist on the D.C. Circuit Court. The man has a resume, to be sure. He knows the landscape of Washington politics, and he is clearly ideologically aligned to the conservative right. So what could that mean for a prospective Supreme Court justice? Well, let's look at some of Brett Kavanaugh's rulings and writings to kind of game that out. So first things first, let's get into the weeds just a little bit. You may or may not have heard of the term Chevron deference before. Just bear with me. I'll try to make this as simple as possible given that I'm not a legal scholar, but understanding Chevron is critical to understanding Kavenaugh and largely the conservative jurist movement. And this is from justia.com as well as the Brookings Institution. So basically, Chevron deference means that an agency, say, for example, the EPA, has the benefit of interpreting a law or statute in its own way, free from interference by the court. Simply put, if an agency is challenged on a policy, the court will defer to the agency's interpretation of the law or policy. The principle is named for a 1984 Supreme Court case, which was Chevron USA versus Natural Resources Defense Council. The case involved a dispute over the Environmental Protection Agency's interpretation of a provision of the Clean Air Act amendments of 1977. So Chevron was challenging the EPA's application of a law, and as confirmed under Chevron, even if a court finds that another interpretation of a statute or law is reasonable or even better than an agency's interpretation, it must defer to the agency's reasonable interpretation. Let's say that another way. Unless Congress has spoken clearly on the subject of a regulation, the court should defer to any agency's decision as long as it is reasonable, even if the court would have reached a different interpretation. Whether a statute is ambiguous, the agency will enjoy wide latitude. This idea of deference to an agency rather than the justice system or Congress goes back to the New Deal, and we're not going to go into all of that. Just suffice it to say that this idea of deference rankles many conservatives. They argue that this gave rise to the modern-day administrative state. One line of reasoning kind of goes like this. If an agency has wide latitude to enact its own policies and are not explicitly granted by law, who has the ability to limit the exercise of those policies? Doing this basically means that the administrative state is a quasi-fourth branch of government that is not explicitly constitutional. Now, agencies are underneath the scope of the executive branch, but the president can't make law. So the president can't force an agency to bend to his or her will. And this is clearly demonstrated by examining how Immigration and Customs Enforcement refused to respect President Obama's directives regarding which undocumented immigrants to focus their attention on. Congress is supposed to step in and either create unambiguous laws in the first place or correct wrong interpretations by federal agencies. Under Chevron, the court has no say and is relegated to following the executive branch and the agency in question. As reported by the Brookings Institute, this is how Kavenaugh views the issue. In a 2016 article in the Harvard Law Review, he states that Chevron, quote, has no basis in the Administrative Procedures Act and represents an atextual invention by the courts. He adds the decision is, quote, nothing more than a judicially orchestrated shift of power from Congress to the executive branch. From my more than 5 years of experience in the White House, he declares, I can confidently claim that Chevron encourages the executive branch, whichever party controls it, to be extremely aggressive in seeking to squeeze its policy goals into ill-fitting statutory authorizations and restraints. Okay, what does all that mean? What it comes down to is that Kavenaugh is inclined to allow the courts to change or eliminate agency policies if those policies are challenged. Who would stop a conservative Supreme Court from, say, gutting federal agencies they didn't like the EPA, or the Civil Rights Commission, or the Department of Education, or the Equal Opportunity Employment Commission, or the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau, which is being gutted from within as we speak, or the Federal Mine Safety and Health Review Commission? You get the point. Kavenaugh has already expressed his dislike for federal agencies and how far their influence can reach. Obviously, federal agencies should have guardrails to prevent them from abusing their power, and I'm looking at you, ICE, but that should be left to Congress. Unfortunately, there's no evidence that our current Congress has the ability to function, let alone write effective and clear policies. With that in mind, let's look at Kavanaugh's record on other issues. Now, there is no way that I can get to all of his major decisions in one show. I mean, it's just not possible, so we're just going to go over some highlights. Kavenaugh wrote a dissent opposing the Affordable Care Act's mandate that employers must include contraception as part of their healthcare offerings. He argued that the mandate infringed on the rights of religious organizations. He sided with the so-called religious liberties crowd. He rejected a challenge to the NSA's warrantless collection of metadata. Remember that? You know how the NSA was, and still is, able to collect all of our information and store it without our consent or knowledge? Kavenaugh argues that that practice was, quote, entirely consistent with the Fourth Amendment. Yeah, I know. Just wow. Brett cheered the late Chief Justice William Rehnquist's efforts to reverse prior Supreme Court attempts at erecting a strict wall of separation between church and state. This one is also concerning in several ways, but mostly because we're witnessing an incremental creep of dogmatic thinking seeping into our educational system, and not to mention our policy making. How many courthouses have 10 Commandment statues, or police vehicles that proclaim, "In God we trust," on the back or side? Having a hard and secure boundary between church and state is a fundamental pillar of American democracy, but Brett Kavenaugh disagrees. He has argued that the FCC rules regarding net neutrality were, quote, unlawful First Amendment violations because corporations are people, I guess? I mean, once again, Kavenaugh is a corporatist, just like most of the conservative jurists on the Supreme Court now. And this next one has a little bit of an odd twist to it. He clearly wants to rein in the EPA's authority as demonstrated by his critique of Obama-era regulations, but in 2012, he penned a decision that rejected the EPA's attempt to curb air pollution that crossed state lines. And it's a well-known, established fact that pollution remains within the legal confines of the state in which it was created. That's science. Look, all sarcasm aside, he did follow up with an interesting tidbit. Quote, on the policy, I understand. It's laudable, and the earth is warming and humans are contributing, Kavenaugh said at the time. But, he added, under our system of separation of powers, Congress is supposed to make these decisions. Now, I wasn't expecting that when I read it. At least he understands that climate change is a real thing and that we need to take it seriously. This exchange also clearly demonstrates his aversion to Chevron deference, claiming that the EPA doesn't have the proper authority to make and enforce air pollution control rules. It becomes clear that Kavenaugh would prefer to eliminate all federal agencies as unconstitutional and simply place the burden of enacting policies on Congress alone. Just think about this for a second and just imagine no federal agencies, no Bureau of Land Management, no EPA. No Department of Education, no Central Intelligence Agency, no Commission on Civil Rights, no Consumer Safety Commission, no Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, and just the list goes on and on and on. Now imagine Congress as it stands now attempting to make laws to manage all of those different things. It would be a clusterfuck of epic proportions. And at the same time, much of the benefits we all enjoy as Americans would simply go away. Conservatives and some liberals may not like the size of the administrative state, but we all enjoy the benefits of it. If the Supreme Court, led by conservatives like Brett Kavenaugh, simply disbanded all federal agencies, more than likely corporations would step in and begin to manage everything from our infrastructure to our educational system to public safety to policing to their own product safety, essentially returning America to the Gilded Age of robber barons, extreme monopolies, unchecked inequality, unfettered pollution, and the worst extremes of poverty and privilege. We have been there before, and we all know how well that worked out.
This is a journey into sound.
One last little thing. Here is yet another example of Kavenaugh being a conservative and a corporatist. In 2010, he wrote for a 3-judge panel regarding the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau that the Dodd-Frank law had wrongly created enormous executive power in the CFPB's single director. Republicans and the banking industry wanted to replace the single director with a multi-member board or commission. Who would sit on that commission? Well, it's a fair guess that it would be the financial industry lobbyists and their congressional loyalists. Brett was accused of being a partisan activist at the time, and it made him popular with the right wing and corporate class, even though the challenge to the CFPB structure was eventually defeated and the structure of the Bureau was upheld. That victory, unfortunately, was short-lived. With all of the insanity we're coping with on a daily basis, you may have missed this little tidbit from about a month ago. The Consumer Financial Protection Bureau, led by Trump's underling and political collaborator Mick Mulvaney, has quietly begun the destruction of the agency from the inside. This is from CBS News. The Trump administration is disbanding a panel of experts focused on protecting consumers from financial abuse. Members of the panel, called the Consumer Advisory Board say Mick Mulvaney has dissolved the group, which includes consumer advocates, financial industry representatives, community leaders, and others. The board advised the CFPB after the housing crash to prevent financial abuse. So this is who President Trump has nominated. I can't argue that Brett Kavenaugh isn't qualified. He's got a long history. He's got loads of writings that are open to the public. He appears to be a competent jurist with a sharp legal mind. However, he's also a man with a clear conservative ideological bent. He has thus far refused to clarify his own thoughts on major decisions like Roe v. Wade, for example, making it difficult to know what he will do if a challenge reaches the court. What is painfully clear is the dismantling of our protections from corporate abuse have already been supercharged under President Trump and would only accelerate if Brett Kavenaugh is seated to the Supreme Court. It is clear that he is a Beltway insider with all the trappings that come with that status. He is a politico who traffics in the waterways of the swamp that Trump has so clearly failed to drain. As it was with the nomination of Neil Gorsuch, Brett Kavanaugh's nomination to the Supreme Court is an insult. The GOP stole a seat on the court from President Obama and did it in the most cynical, conniving way possible. Neil Gorsuch should never have been seated on the bench, nor should Trump get to nominate a second Supreme Court justice in the first half of his first term in office as punishment for their corruption. The whole thing reeks of partisan hackery. I mean, to be clear, I'm not advocating that we need some hard left-leaning jurist either. The Supreme Court should be filled with moderates who strive to help guide the nation along a constitutional path. Stacking the court with partisan hacks, even experienced qualified ones, is wrong for America, and it will have repercussions for more than a generation. Call or write your representatives right now. I mean, literally, now is the time. Contact your representatives in both the House and the Senate, and if you only get a staffer on the phone, tell them too. Remind them that there should be no hearings on Kavanaugh's nominee until after the midterm election. None. And remind them that every Democrat in the Senate is a no vote for his confirmation. Focus on the red state Democrats. Make sure that they are a strong no when it comes to Kavanaugh's appointment. And FYI, in case you want to know, they're Indiana Senator Joe Donnelly, North Dakota Senator Heidi Heitkamp, and West Virginia's Joe Manchin. All three are red state Dems, and they are the only Democrats who voted to confirm Neil Gorsuch in 2017. Let's make sure they don't vote the wrong way a second time.
Part 2 of the James Chambers show Cavelcade of Kavenaugh is coming. Hang in there. I know this episode is long. You may want to take a pee break. Either way, don't give up. You can do it. There is candy in my van. Do you want some candy? It's really good candy. I am not human. I am a narwhal.
Here we are at the second part of the show. And now that you have a basic understanding of who Brett Kavenaugh is and how he's likely to vote, let's look at how his name was floated in the first place. When Anthony Kennedy submitted his resignation letter to President Trump, it must have been a magical moment for the president. He was now able to whip up some frenzy in the base and relive an old campaign promise that he will nominate the sharpest conservative legal minds to the Supreme Court, and any court, it seems. Trump and the Senate Republicans have been remarkably successful at appointing judges. I mean, it helps that the Democrats can't stop them, but, whatever. 1 in every 8 circuit court judge has been appointed by Donald Trump. Yeah, you heard that right. 1 in 8 circuit court of appeals judge has been appointed by Donald Trump and is confirmed in the Republican-held Senate. There is a massive shift happening right now in our justice system. It's being pushed to the right with a serious quickness. But I digress. How did Trump find his magic list of judges to help him make the Supreme Court pick? Let's get real. He didn't pick any of these people himself. I mean, come on. He can't be bothered to read daily security briefings. His aides have to bullet point one-page reports from his cabinet. Otherwise, he just won't read them. He has said openly that he likes people who look the part no matter their qualification. He openly brags about the fact he doesn't bother preparing for meetings, and sometimes meetings at the highest level. We witnessed that in action last week as the lead up to this Trump-Putin meeting in Helsinki. Look, there's no universe in which Donald John Trump diligently researched and personally vetted dozens of judges from across the country to compile his personal short list of nominees. I don't buy it for one hot second. Where did this magic shortlist come from, you ask? Well, that's easy. It came from names compiled and vetted by the Heritage Foundation with the additional assistance of a little-known political player from the Federalist Society. His name is Leonard Leo. Leo is who we're going to talk about here today. This guy makes the Koch brothers look like political amateurs. He eats Mercers for breakfast and nibbles an Adelson for a little snack later. Leonard Leo is the quiet, unassuming guy who is changing the judicial landscape of America that almost no one hears about. He is Kaiser Sose.
Nobody ever believed he was real. Nobody ever knew him or saw anybody that ever worked directly for him. And like that, he's gone.
Leonard Leo is the executive vice president at the Federalist Society. And don't be fooled by the vice president status. He runs the place. This is from their website. The Federalist Society is a group of conservatives and libertarians interested in the current state of legal order. It's emphatically the province and duty of the judiciary to say what the law is and not what it should be. This entails reordering priorities within the legal system to place a premium on individual liberty, traditional values, and the rule of law. It also requires restoring the recognition of the importance of these norms among lawyers, judges, law students, and professors. In working to achieve these goals, the Society has created a conservative and libertarian intellectual network that extends to all levels of the legal community. And look, they aren't kidding. For example, all of the appeals court judges that Trump has appointed, all but one, is a member or affiliate of the Federalist Society. Also, take note of the buzzwords in their description, individual liberty, traditional values, the rule of law. These are clear and specific indicators that this organization has a hard right conservative and religious bias. And that makes sense given that Leo himself is an extremely devout Catholic. When he travels, his staff is tasked with finding a church close to him so that he can attend Mass every day. He's also a member of the extremely secretive and ultra-Orthodox Knights of Malta, which is a Catholic order founded in the 12th century that functions separate from the Vatican. It has United Nations status and has enormous land and financial holdings around the world. So, yeah, he's pretty religious. Leo is deeply conservative, and he has spent his entire adult career attempting to reshape the federal judiciary to reflect a more rigid, religious, and conservative dogma. He believes that life begins at conception, and he is vehemently anti-abortion, anti-LGBTQ, and a proponent of natural law, which basically means that all nature was designed with a function. That function was created by God and therefore perfect, and it stands above any secular law that humans can create. Leo has also used his faith to discriminate against other people of other religions. While he was working for the George W. Bush administration as the chairman for the U.S. Commission on International Religious Freedom, he was sued by a Muslim employee who claims she was terminated because of her faith. And the ironic contradictions here are just wild. But it follows then that in 2011, Leo, along with Ginny Thomas, who's the wife of Supreme Court Justice Clarence Thomas, founded a group called Liberty Central, a Tea Party-affiliated group that successfully blocked the creation of the Islamic Cultural Center known to the pundits in the conservative media as the Ground Zero Mosque. Leonard Leo has had a decisive influence on the appointments of Justice Alito, Chief Justice Roberts, and Justice Gorsuch to the Supreme Court. He also had a direct hand in stonewalling the nomination of one Merrick Garland, so pulling names from the Heritage Foundation's list, Leonard Leo got to work with White House counsel Don McGahn to make a shortlist for the president. Out of 25 names on the final list presented to Donald Trump, all but one are members or associates of the activist Federalist Society. Now, the Society has done a good job at bringing extremist legal views into the mainstream narrative. And this is from the Daily Beast. They argue that most of the New Deal and the administrative state are unconstitutional, that corporations have free speech and free religious rights, and that women and LGBTQ people are not protected classes under constitutional law, and that there is no right to privacy implied by the Due Process Clause of the Constitution, i.e., abortion, contraception, gay marriage are all entirely unconstitutional. 2 decades ago, hardly anyone in the legal academy would even take these ideas seriously. I mean, they're scholarly ideas, you bat around in law journals and intellectual exercises. But now, these are litmus tests for conservative judges. And that litmus test has provided us with one Brett Kavenaugh. An interesting perspective on this is how Leo operates. And how does he operate? Well, he hides behind LLC and shell companies to make his influence known. For example, in 2009, in order to help push through Bush's judicial appointments before he left office, Leo created the Judicial Confirmation Network. Under President Obama, he rebranded the organization the Judicial Crisis Network. The JCN and the Federalist Society are two arms of the same being. They cross staff and they often work out of each other's offices. The Society creates the judges, and the JCN promotes them. So in effect, the Judicial Crisis Network is just the PR wing of the Federalist Society. And both are Leonard Leo. Unfortunately, JCN is classified as a 501c4 social welfare organization, so there's no real way to see what their records are and how to track the huge amounts of dark money that are being trafficked through it. We do know that JCN reportedly spent $17 million to scuttle Merrick Garland and promote Neil Gorsuch, and clearly the influence of that was effective. Now, if that wasn't enough, Leonard Leo used $30 million of dark money to donate to George Mason University School of Law in 2016. That school has since been renamed for Antonin Scalia. When the payment was disclosed, Leo affirmed that $10 million of those dollars came from the Koch brothers, but the other $20 million was anonymous, and it was anonymously routed through a shell company called the BH Fund. Oh, Leo is also the president of the BH Fund. Leo then donated that anonymous money in his own name. The real question is, what does $30 million buy you these days? Well, it seems it can buy you a law school. This is again from the Daily Beast. A May 2018 Freedom of Information request have shown that the law school regularly consults with Leo on developing programs, hiring faculty, admitting prospective students, and placing students in federal clerkships. The documents released as part of the FOIA request show Leo intervening multiple times on behalf of conservative students and faculty candidates and promoting curricula on, quote, law and economics, which predominantly favors conservative legal positions by evaluating issues in terms of financial efficiency rather than justice. Rather than merely grooming conservative law students at schools across the country, now Leo has a conservative Federalist Society law school to call his very own. Now comes the really shady shit, the money. Leo has the benefit of being supported by millions of dollars in dark money. The largest of these dark money organizations is the Wellspring Committee, which is an offshoot of the Koch organization. Wellspring has funded other Koch groups like Americans for Prosperity by moving millions of dollars through multiple layers of shell companies and LLCs, all in an attempt to obscure where the funds originated. Between its inception in 2008 and 2011, Wellspring raised over $24 million and distributed out $17 million to shell companies. In 2016, Wellspring received nearly all of its revenue from one anonymous donor, equaling roughly $28.5 million. From that money, Wellspring delivered a grant to the Judicial Crisis Network representing 83% of that group's revenue for 2016. You want more? How about this? Leo listed his employer as BH Group, as opposed to BH Fund, which was noted earlier on a recent campaign finance disclosure. Well, who owns the BH Group? Leonard Leo. The BH Group, another C4 organization, received over $750,000 from Wellspring Committee and another $947,000 from the Judicial Crisis Network. So, in other words, Leonard Leo and Leonard Leo paid Leonard Leo $1.7 million in dark money. And what became of all that money that was shuffled around in Shell and C4 companies? Well, that's a really good question. We really don't know. We do know that $1 million was donated by BH Group, aka Leonard Leo, to the Trump Inauguration Committee, even though the $1 million was publicly described as anonymous. Who else contributes to the vast sea of dark money controlled by Leonard Leo? Koch Industries, the Mercer Family Foundation, the Chamber of Commerce, the White House counselor Kellyanne Conway and her husband, as well as Chevron, Google, Microsoft, and Pfizer, just to name a few. Robert McGuire from the Center for Responsive Politics had this to say about after the inauguration payment. Quote, "It's really quite striking. Someone who orchestrated a secret $1 million contribution to President Trump's inaugural committee has been given enormous discretion over one of the most important decisions President Trump will ever make. And that same person is central to orchestrating the funding of two dark money groups that will barrage people in certain parts of the country promoting whoever is ultimately nominated." This is how I think happened. Leo called White House counsel Don McGahn and said, "Donnie, I've got a judge for you." And they formulated a list of jurists to deliver to Donald Trump. Trump then selected Brett Kavenaugh. We now know more about Kavenaugh and his personal agenda for the court. We also know that there's no way that Leonard Leo would have allowed Brett's name to be on that short list for the Supreme Court if he didn't represent the values of the Federalist Society. For example, to place a premium on individual liberty and traditional values and the rule of law. Most importantly, they want to tear apart the foundation of the administrative state, and we have discussed how dangerous that can be. One more note. Many people are concerned that Kavenaugh will vote to either gut or overturn Roe v. Wade, effectively taking away women's reproductive rights and the right to personal liberty. There's a good case to be concerned. Although he hasn't said anything specific, at least not in public, Kavenaugh was selected by Leo because of his ideas and his politics. Ed Whalen, a former clerk of Antonin Scalia and president of the Ethics and Public Policy Center, wrote in December of 2016, quote, "No one has ever been more dedicated to the enterprise of building a Supreme Court that will overturn Roe v. Wade than the Federalist Society's Leonard Leo. You don't get handpicked by the most conservative organizations in politics today and not line up with their ideology. If Kavenaugh is confirmed, well, I think we all know where that court goes." Brett Kavenaugh is the face pasted onto the extremely conservative religious right wing, and he's being offered up by one of the slipperiest, dark money, backroom dealing swamp creatures in Leonard Leo. The interest of Leonard Leo is clear: to enforce highly conservative and religious dogma onto the judicial branch of government. He's creating a space in the public sphere to co-opt mainstream conservative ideas and insert his brand of hard fundamentalism. And so far, he's been extremely successful. If Leo's agenda is allowed to proceed unchecked, America will become a dangerous place for our civil liberties and our freedoms, no matter your political leanings. Although, come to think of it, Brett Kavanaugh's young. He sure looks like what you'd expect a judge to look like. So, of course, President Trump picked him. How could he not? I mean, the photo op is going to be great. Thank you for listening to the Cavelcade of Kavenaugh edition of the James Chambers Show. And congrats to you. You made it through this long slog of information in one piece. I hope you did, anyway. And there's way too many sources to cite quickly, but I'm going to try. We've got the Heritage Foundation, the Brookings Institute, Politico, the New York Times, the Washington Post, the Federalist Society, the Chicago Tribune, the Los Angeles Times, the Daily Beast, the Guardian, Reuters, PolitiFact, CBS News, and probably a bunch more that I'm missing. Remember, call your representatives in both the House and the Senate and tell them to stand firm and postpone hearings on Brett Kavenaugh until after the midterm elections. Tell them to vote no on confirmation of Kavenaugh. Put the pressure on and help your friends and family call their reps as well. We must put the brakes on this unprecedented ideological power grab. Whether you're liberal or conservative, it really doesn't matter. No good can come of this hard shift in ideology in the legal system. It hurts everyone, no matter your party. If you have any thoughts or comments on this insanely long episode of the show, well, leave me a note in the comments section below. Or you can email the show at realjcshow2017@gmail.com. That's realjcshow2017@gmail.com. Or reach out on Twitter at realjcshow. Thanks again for listening. I really appreciate all of you. Until next time. Members of the panel called the Consumer Advocacy Board. No. Members of